Alright, so welcome to Unit 13, Cold War Notes. Woohoo! We have made it to the end. These are the last notes that we will have to do this year. So we start off talking about post-war Europe and what the situation is. Please take note that the Soviet Union is once again the country that has felt the most death. The most folks have died. That's going to play a big role in our story here in just a moment. Civilian casualties, so again that idea of total war and bombs not caring whether you're a civilian or in the military. They just do their jobs and take out entire blocks of towns. Cities leveled: Warsaw, that's of course Poland, London, Dresden and Berlin. A lot of folks are just going to make the mistake of thinking it's Germany that has to be rebuilt, but of course there are other places too, and many folks are going to be displaced, especially when you start talking about the Jewish community, and that's going to of course lead to the establishment of the State of Israel. So designing the peace, you got the Atlantic Charter. Eventually the United Nations are going to be created, and this time of course U.S. involvement. So take a moment to look back at your United Nations worksheet in order to kind of see the particulars of how the United Nations is formed, its setup, particularly the United States and the other Security Council members. More agreements, and we will do an activity in class with this slide, of course, with the three conferences and how these three conferences really shape what's going to happen with the Cold War. It's important on these conferences to take note of the months as well as the years that they took place. We start off in Tehran in November of '43 with the big three: Roosevelt, Stalin, and Churchill. Please make sure that you understand who the big three are and at what times. Now, since the war is still going on in '43, they're not making plans on how to split the territory up. They don't have it yet. They're making plans on how to get that territory, how to liberate, how to basically go on the offensive and end the war with Hitler. This is a time of turnaround for the Allies. There has been, again, a shift in who's winning the war. D-Day has occurred in June, and now the United States and the other of the big three are on the offensive, but they still have to actually win the war. Going down to Yalta in February of '45. Now we've got a winner here. The end of the war is near. In a few short months, Adolf Hitler will have committed suicide, and the war in Europe will be over. It'll take a little longer for the United States to end their war with Japan, but for now, the end is near. The end is near for the European war, and essentially they're going to try and figure out what they're going to do with Germany. And this is where things get interesting. At Yalta, you have the infamous picture of Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt all sitting together, and by body language you can tell, Stalin is not necessarily as chummy with the other two of the big three. And again, he goes there for one reason. If you recall from our Stalin video, he wants to make sure he leaves there with a security zone for Russia. No one's going to invade Russia again. He has to keep Russia safe. So let's take a look at what's actually going on at Yalta. They divide Germany up into 4 zones. So each of the countries are going to take a zone: Britain, France, US, and the USSR. They're going to make joint decisions about Germany. Also, and this is kind of unique to the World War II and the split up of Germany, this one town of Berlin, which is actually located in the USSR section, the USSR sector of Germany, is also split up into 4 different quadrants. So Germany split up into quadrants as well as Berlin. That's going to play a major role in our story here in just a moment. Reparations are in the 20 billion and they're going to be collected from each zone. Now this is more of a win-win situation. If you recall back to World War I and Treaty of Versailles, make the Germans cry, that situation isn't necessarily repeated here. The territories will go in and rebuild the different sectors so that they can produce and actually get their war reparations. And as hopefully you've noted here in large, bold blue print, the Soviets are going to get an additional 25% from the rest of the Atlantic Control Council, from Britain, France, and the U.S. And hopefully by now you have guessed why they would get the additional money from the other three. If you guessed they're the ones who lost the most people, then hey, you are the winner this time. Now, finally, and this is where it gets a little strange, the ambiguous compromise. Ambiguous, of course, meaning unclear. If you say, Miss Duncan, what's going to be on the test, and I say everything from the unit, that is a bit ambiguous. It's not as clear as you would like for me to be. Well, we have one of those such compromises in the Yalta Conference. The countries liberated are going to have freely elected governments, but they're expected to be pro-Russian governments. So the underlying message is that these governments will become communist. Because again, remember, Stalin's not leaving without a security zone. And a lot of the countries that are going to be liberated are going to be in Eastern Europe. And right there in that area that you would have to invade and go through in order to get to Russia. Now finally, we have a post-war agreement. Notice question mark in the agreement. That might be the wrong word to be using for this. The Potsdam Conference. So now we have the Potsdam Conference in July of 1945, and notice we have a new addition. It is not the original Big Three anymore, because in April of 1945, in between Yalta and Potsdam, we have the death of Franklin Roosevelt. Now, as I told you in class, please make sure that you do not mistake Franklin Roosevelt, World War II, and New Deal, Depression. Franklin Roosevelt, four-term president, with Teddy Roosevelt from the late 1800s, the Rough Rider, and the one that did not have polio. FDR has polio. So please, again, make sure that you get the correct Roosevelt when you're speaking of World War II. Potsdam 1945, Harry Truman is now on the scene, and he's going to demand free elections in Eastern Europe. And with the Harry Truman dynamic from Roosevelt, it's kind of like the Chamberlain switch over to Churchill. Chamberlain, of course, if you recall, was our guy who was constantly appeasing Hitler and thought that he had peace in our time. And then, of course, that does not work out as well as he had thought, and Churchill takes over. Well, same thing here. Essentially, Truman comes in, and he's not going to have these free elections in Eastern Europe that Stalin, he is wanting to have free elections, not this pro-Russian stuff that Stalin wants to have. And of course, he and Stalin are going to disagree on this issue. So Truman's going to stand up for these free elections and stand up to Stalin. Now, you could debate whether or not Roosevelt would have taken the same stance. No one really can tell. In February, the war's not quite over yet. He still needs to work with the members of the other members of the Big Three, where in July, war in Europe is over. Who knows what Roosevelt would have done had he been alive, but we do know Truman comes in and he is not willing to play ball with Stalin. Positive results of the negotiations. Please make sure that you take a look at these, especially with the United Nations. And remember, as I said in class, they like to throw the word revanchism at you instead of just saying revenge for losses. The changeovers we'll discuss in class, and the Nazi leaders were held responsible, not the whole entire country, but the major leaders of the Nazi Party. And again, refresh your memory on Nuremberg laws, Nuremberg rallies, and Nuremberg trials. And just as an extra reminder down there at the bottom, if you go watch this link, on the Nuremberg trials. Again, please remember some stark images of the concentration camps. Please be aware before you click play. Post-war tensions, the beginning of the Cold War. There are three views that folks take about what really happened and what led and what was going on after the Cold War. So take a look at the difference between the three. There's one particular practice test that has this specific question on it. Traditionalists being everything was Stalin's fault. Revisionists that say that the U.S. and its desire to protect capitalism is the problem. And then post-revisionism, that the USSR, it's kind of a mix. USSR to blame, but hey, you know what? The USSR was more to blame than the traditionalists said. So a nice healthy mix of, they kind of both did things that they probably shouldn't have done. Ideologies. Cold War is all a war of ideology. So please make sure that you've got these two types of ideologies, political and economic, straight in your head, and you know who's fighting for which side. As we said earlier, Truman takes this get tough stance, and he is not going to fall in line with these pro-Russian elections. So by 1945, he cuts off all aid to the Soviet Union. Remember how they had to pay that extra 25% to the Soviets because they lost more people? Well, guess what? He's going to stop paying it. By March 46, the United States is going to say that they're never going to recognize governments that are established against the will of the people. AKA, if you force these countries to be communist, we will not recognize them as communist. And that's when Churchill goes and makes his famous Iron Curtain speech that we will talk about in class. So please take a look to listen to the Iron Curtain speech video, and here's the essential phrases that you will need to look at. And like I said, we're going to take a look at this in class together. And finally, what is the message of this cartoon? Essentially, I would like for you to kind of do L1 and L2 in your head and come up with some great L3 ideas. So please take a look at the cartoon. Now that you've taken a look at the cartoon, I would actually like for you to go back to the Iron Curtain speech and see, can you see where an iron curtain might fall in this cartoon? Checkup questions. At this point in the video, please take a look at these three questions. Go back, make sure that you can answer these questions, and submit your answers via Edmodo quiz entitled Cold War Checkup Number 1.